It's June 1980, and a Baptist preacher in Lynchburg, Virginia gets a phone call that will reshape American politics for the next 4 decades. Jerry Falwell, a man who once proudly declared that preachers should stay out of politics, is about to become the most powerful political minister in the country. But here's what most people don't know. This wasn't his idea. It wasn't even about what he thought it was about. What happened in that phone call and in the secret meetings that preceded it reveals one of the most successful political operations in modern history. A calculated campaign that turned Sunday morning sermons into partisan rallying cries and transformed Southern churches from houses of worship into precinct headquarters. The story we've been told is simple. Evangelical Christians, horrified by Roe v. Wade in 1973, spontaneously rose up to reclaim America for God. But the documents tell a different story. The real story involves backroom deals, IRS audits, segregated schools, and a brilliantly cynical realization by a group of political strategists that they could harness the most powerful force in American life, religious conviction, and weaponize it for partisan gain. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig into the stories that shaped our world. If you appreciate the research that goes into these deep dives, consider leaving a super thanks to help keep this channel going. Now, let's go back to where this really began, because it wasn't 1973. It wasn't even about abortion. The year is 1971, and Paul Weyrich is frustrated. A conservative political operative with burning ambition, Weyrich has been trying for years to build a mass movement of conservative voters. But he keeps hitting the same wall. The country club Republicans don't have the numbers. The business conservatives don't inspire passion. He needs something bigger, something that can mobilize millions of Americans who don't normally care about capital gains taxes or regulatory policy. He needs an army, and he knows exactly where to find one, in the pews of evangelical churches across the American South. But there's a problem. These churches want nothing to do with politics. Evangelical leaders in the early 1970s are almost unanimous in their belief that the church should stay out of the political arena. In 1965, Jerry Falwell himself preached a sermon called Ministers and Marchers, where he explicitly condemned clergy involvement in civil rights protests and political activism. Preachers are not called to be politicians, Falwell declared, but to be soul winners. This wasn't just Falwell, this was the dominant evangelical position. Billy Graham had said something similar. So had most of the major evangelical leaders. Even more problematic for Weyrich's plans, when Roe v. Wade was decided in January 1973, the evangelical response was basically nothing. The Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in America, passed a resolution in 1971 calling for legislation that would allow abortion in cases of rape, incest, fetal deformity, and threats to the mother's health. In 1974, 1 year after Roe, they reaffirmed this position. W.A. Criswell, the influential pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas and a former president of the Southern Baptist Convention, told a reporter in 1973, "I have always felt that it was only after a child was born and had a life separate from its mother that it became an individual person, and it has always therefore seemed to me that what is best for the mother and for future should be allowed." Let me say that again, because this shocks most people. The Southern Baptist Convention supported abortion rights for years after Roe v. Wade. Christianity Today, the flagship evangelical magazine founded by Billy Graham, published articles suggesting that abortion might be acceptable in many circumstances. The evangelical response to Roe was muted at best, sometimes supportive. So what changed? What could possibly transform these churches from political abstinence to political warfare? The answer is taxes, and schools, and racism, though that's the part that gets carefully edited out of the official story. In 1969, the first year of Nixon's presidency, a group of black parents in Mississippi sued to ensure that school integration actually happened in their state. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund brought the case, and it worked. The Nixon administration, under pressure from the courts, began enforcing integration. Suddenly, private segregation academies started popping up across the South like mushrooms after rain. These weren't called segregation academies, of course. They were Christian schools or private academies. But their purpose was crystal clear. They were established so white parents could avoid sending their children to integrated public schools. By 1974, there were approximately 3,500 of these private Christian schools in the United States. And they had a problem. The IRS, under court order, had established new rulings that denied tax-exempt status to racially discriminatory private schools. This was a big deal. Without tax-exempt status, these schools would struggle financially, and donors couldn't write off their contributions. The most famous case involved Bob Jones University in South Carolina. Bob Jones University did admit black students after 1971, but it prohibited interracial dating and marriage. The IRS revoked its tax-exempt status in 1976. The university fought back, and the case would eventually reach the Supreme Court in 1983. Here's where our story gets interesting. Paul Weyrich and his colleagues, political operatives like Richard Viguerie, Howard Phillips, and Ed McAteer, saw an opportunity. They'd been trying to politicize evangelicals for years with issues like pornography and school prayer, with limited success. But this IRS situation, this made evangelical pastors angry in a way they'd never been angry before. The government was coming after their schools and their tax exemptions. This was personal. Weyrich and his team began organizing. They set up meetings with evangelical leaders. They flew pastors to Washington. They explained that this wasn't just about taxes. This was about religious freedom, about government overreach, about defending their way of life. They were building a movement. But they had a problem, and Weyrich knew it. As he would later admit in a candid interview in the 1990s, you can't build a national political movement around protecting segregated schools. The optics are terrible. You need a different issue, something that sounds more noble, something that middle America can rally behind without shame. Where are you watching this from, by the way? And what time is it where you are? I'm always curious about the global reach of these historical deep dives. Drop your location and your profession in the comments. I love seeing who's interested in this kind of political archaeology. Enter abortion. It wasn't the issue that motivated these leaders initially, but it was the issue that could work publicly. By the late 1970s, Weyrich and his allies had their strategy. They would mobilize evangelical churches using the IRS threats as the private motivation, but they would message publicly around abortion, prayer in schools, and traditional family values. These were issues that photographed better, that could be discussed in polite company, that could build a broad coalition. Francis Schaeffer, an evangelical philosopher and filmmaker, became crucial to this effort. His film series, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, co-produced with future Surgeon General C. Everett Koop, toured the country in 1979, presenting abortion as a Holocaust-level moral crisis. The tour was designed not just to educate, but to mobilize, to turn abstract concerns into political action. And then came the phone call to Jerry Falwell. It was actually a series of meetings and calls, orchestrated by Weyrich and his colleagues. They needed a face for their movement, and Falwell was perfect. Telegenic, articulate, already famous from his old-time Gospel Hour television program, and now thoroughly convinced that government intrusion into Christian institutions was an existential threat. In 1979, Falwell founded the Moral Majority. Contrary to the mythology, this wasn't a grassroots uprising. It was a top-down political operation. Weyrich reportedly even came up with the name Moral Majority at a meeting in Falwell's office. The organization had funding from conservative donors, direct mail expertise from Richard Viguerie, and a clear mission: register evangelical voters and turn them into a reliable Republican voting bloc. The timing was perfect. Jimmy Carter, despite being a born-again Baptist Sunday school teacher, had disappointed many evangelicals with his liberal policies and his comments supporting some gay rights positions. The IRS threat to religious schools was intensifying, and the Republican Party, fresh off devastating losses in the post-Watergate era, desperately needed new voters. Ronald Reagan, a divorced Hollywood actor who rarely attended church, became the candidate of the religious right. Think about that irony for a moment. The man who would become the hero of evangelical voters wasn't particularly religious himself. He had been pro-choice as governor of California, signing one of the most liberal abortion laws in the country in 1967. But Reagan understood the deal being offered. He would champion their social issues and they would deliver millions of votes. The 1980 election was the proof of concept. White evangelicals, who had been politically divided in previous elections, voted overwhelming for Reagan, giving him somewhere between 61% and 67% of their votes, depending on how you measure. Falwell's moral majority claimed credit for registering millions of new voters, though the actual numbers were likely inflated. What wasn't inflated was the perception that evangelical voters had become a powerful, organized political force. But here's what's fascinating. While abortion became the public face of this movement, the behind-the-scenes priority remained the school tax exemption issue. When Reagan took office, one of his administration's first actions was to attempt to restore tax-exempt status to segregated schools, including Bob Jones University. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Even many Republicans were horrified. The administration backed down, and eventually the Supreme Court ruled 8-1 against Bob Jones University in 1983, with only Justice William Rehnquist dissenting. By that point, though, it didn't matter. The infrastructure was built. The religious right had momentum, and critically, the issue focus had successfully shifted. A new generation of evangelical voters genuinely believed that abortion was the founding issue of their political activism. The Segregation Academy origins had been successfully memory-holed. The takeover of the pulpit accelerated through the 1980s. Organizations like the Christian Coalition, founded by Pat Robertson after his failed 1988 presidential bid, took the moral majority model and improved it. They created voter guides that were distributed in churches. They organized precinct-level captains. They built phone banks and door-knocking operations. They turned church membership directories into campaign contact lists. Ralph Reed, the young political operative who became the first executive director of the Christian Coalition, was explicit about the strategy. In a 1991 interview, he said the Christian right had learned from previous mistakes. They were going to work quietly under the radar. "I want to be invisible," Reed said. "I do guerrilla warfare. I paint my face and travel at night. You don't know it's over until you're in a body bag." He was talking about taking over Republican Party structures at the local level, showing up at county GOP meetings, running for precinct captain positions, getting elected to school boards. It was methodical, patient, and devastatingly effective. By the mid-1990s, the Christian Coalition had effective control of Republican Party organizations in over a dozen states. The Bible Belt became a battlefield in ways both literal and figurative. Abortion clinic bombings and violence escalated through the 1980s and 1990s. Church services became political rallies. Pastors endorsed candidates from the pulpit, technically violating their tax-exempt status, but rarely facing enforcement. The line between spiritual authority and political authority blurred until it was nearly invisible. Consider what happened in a single election cycle, 1994. The Christian Coalition distributed 33 million voter guides in churches across the country the weekend before the election. These guides presented candidates' positions on issues selected and framed to favor Republicans, but they were presented as nonpartisan. Churches that would never have allowed explicit political campaigning on their property welcomed these guides as educational materials. The result? The Republican Revolution of 1994, when the GOP took control of Congress for the first time in 40 years. The takeover wasn't just organizational, it was theological. Entire denominations shifted rightward. The Southern Baptist Convention, which, as we discussed, had been relatively moderate on abortion in the 1970s, underwent a conservative takeover starting with the 1979 election of Adrian Rogers as SBC president. Over the next decade, moderates were systematically purged from leadership positions. Professors at Southern Baptist seminaries were required to affirm biblical inerrancy or lose their jobs. The new leadership aligned closely with Republican Party positions on virtually every issue. This wasn't organic theological evolution, it was coordinated political strategy. Conservative activists identified key elections for denominational leadership, mobilized supporters, and took control systematically, convention by convention, seminary by seminary. Critics within the denomination called it a political coup disguised as religious reformation. The independent megachurches that rose to prominence in the 1980s and 1990s were even more explicitly political. Without denominational hierarchies to navigate, pastors like James Dobson, D. James Kennedy, and later Rick Warren had direct access to massive congregations and media empires. Focus on the Family, founded by Dobson in 1977, started as a radio program about parenting and became a political powerhouse, with a mailing list of millions and annual revenue in the hundreds of millions. These megachurch pastors and parachurch organizations created a parallel media ecosystem: radio shows, television programs, publishing houses, and eventually websites that could promote political messages while maintaining their religious nonprofit status. The content was sophisticated, mixing genuine spiritual teaching with political propaganda so seamlessly that many viewers couldn't distinguish between theological truth claims and partisan talking points. The consequences have been profound. Church attendance is now one of the strongest predictors of voting behavior in the United States, stronger than income, education, or even geography in many cases. The percentage of white evangelicals who identify as Republican has increased from roughly 50-50 in the 1970s to approximately 75 to 80% today. The political polarization of American religion is unlike anything seen in other Western democracies. But there's been a cost, one that's becoming increasingly visible. Younger Americans are leaving organized religion at unprecedented rates. When asked why, many cite the perception that churches are more interested in political power than spiritual truth. The percentage of Americans who identify as religiously unaffiliated has grown from around 5% in 1972 to over 25% today. Among millennials and Gen Z, the numbers are even higher. Some observers call this the moral majority exodus, a direct backlash against the politicization of religion. Research by sociologists like Robert Jones at the Public Religion Research Institute suggests that the close identification between white evangelical Christianity and Republican politics has actually accelerated secularization among young people who might otherwise have remained culturally Christian. The irony is almost poetic. The political operatives who set out in the 1970s to save Christian America by mobilizing churches for conservative politics may have actually accelerated the decline of religious affiliation in America. The pulpit became a platform for partisan messages, and many young people decided they wanted no part of either the religion or the politics. Today, the patterns established in that 1980 phone call to Jerry Falwell continue to shape American politics. Presidential candidates make pilgrimages to evangelical gatherings. Supreme Court nominations become referendums on abortion and religious liberty. Churches remain powerful organizing centers for political campaigns, especially in the South and Midwest. But the Bible Belt itself is changing. Cities like Atlanta, Charlotte, and Nashville are becoming more diverse, more secular, more politically competitive. The old consensus, where Christianity, conservatism, and Southern identity were all parts of an indivisible package, is fracturing. Younger evangelicals are more likely to care about climate change, racial justice, and immigration reform than their parents were. Some remain conservative but reject the partisan capture of their faith. Others have left evangelicalism entirely. The battlefield remains, but the battle lines are shifting. Some evangelical leaders have started acknowledging the cost of their political entanglement. Russell Moore, formerly of the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, has been publicly critical of the way evangelical institutions compromise their witness for political access. "We're now reaping the whirlwind of that," Moore has said, pointing to the crisis of credibility facing evangelical Christianity. Meanwhile, a new generation of political operatives is trying to replicate the old playbook, but with diminishing returns. Church attendance is down. Trust in religious institutions is down. The percentage of Americans who believe religion should have less influence in politics has been growing. Paul Weyrich, before his death in 2008, reflected on his legacy with some ambivalence. He had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams in politicizing evangelical Christianity and building a reliable Republican voting bloc. But he also saw the backlash, the polarization, the way that politics had corrupted religious institutions, just as surely as he had hoped religion would purify politics. The story of how political operatives took over the pulpit is ultimately a story about power, how to acquire it, how to maintain it, and what you're willing to sacrifice to keep it. It's a story about brilliant strategic thinking applied to religious conviction. It's a story about how a movement founded on protecting segregated schools successfully rebranded itself around abortion. It's a story about how Sunday morning became indistinguishable from a campaign rally in much of America. And it's a story that's still being written, because while the Bible Belt may have become a battlefield, the war is far from over. The tactics have evolved, the demographics are shifting, and the consequences of that 1980 transformation are still unfolding in ways we're only beginning to understand. The question now is whether American Christianity can disentangle itself from partisan politics, or whether the marriage arranged by those political operatives 50 years ago is permanent. The answer will shape not just the future of religion in America, but the future of American democracy itself. Thanks for watching, Professor Archive. This is the kind of deep research and historical investigation that takes serious time and effort. If you found this valuable, if you learned something you didn't know, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. And don't forget to answer that question: where are you watching from and what's your profession? I'm genuinely curious who finds these deep dives into political history compelling. Until next time, keep questioning the stories you've been told, because there's always more beneath the surface.